welcome everybody to another developer interview cast for our Perceptive podcast series. For today's episode, we're going to be talking dungeon crawling, wizardry, and the entire first-person CRPG design. My guest is an indie developer working on the game Realms and Ruins Abencor. So please welcome from Bonedude Game Studios, Bonebrah. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you so much for wanting to come on. And I was just telling them a minute ago, if you are a developer working on a game, want to talk about development or anything like that, please reach out. I'm always looking for guests. But thank you again for coming on. I'm sure this is going to be a great chat. As I was just telling them, I have played a lot of dungeon crawlers, first person, the whole deal, so this should be a lot of fun. So, I guess to begin with, since it's your first time on, can you talk a little bit about what your background is when it comes to game dev?
Yeah, sure. So my background in game development is pretty short for the most part. For a commercial project, I've really only been doing this for like 2 years now. So specifically on the Realms and Ruins Abencor project. Before that, I played around with some game tools like RPG Maker. Big fan of Neverwinter Nights, so I played around with the tool set for that back when the enhanced edition came out in like 2019. I was really big into that for a while, and then just throughout the years playing with stuff like Half-Life had some tools for map making, Warcraft, Starcraft, all of those. So real game development. 2 years, but over the years I've liked to tinker and mess around with creation tools. So
Yeah, so what kind of attracted you to a dungeon crawling CRPG design for your first commercial project?
oh man, so actually this project, just a little bit of background on it, originally started out like I mentioned before. I was big into Neverwinter Nights and the tool set there. It actually started out as that. So I was messing around with learning the scripting language and all that stuff, building out maps and doing the whole thing. And I kind of burnt out a little bit on that, and then found it's kind of like RPG Maker in a way. It's called RPG in a Box. So that's the engine that I'm
Okay.
using to create Realms and Ruins. So one of the reasons I wanted to do first person is I'm just a big fan of the genre, right? So grew up playing, all the old wizardries and Might and Magic and stuff like that. And I don't know what it is. There's just something about the grid step movement, and the grid maps and all of that stuff. I'm just a big fan of it. I think it makes for a different type of gameplay that's still fun. And RPG in a Box just was ended up being a pretty cool engine that worked for my needs, and it kind of had a built-in flip of the switch grid movement that worked really well. So I was super happy with it and decided to kind of migrate my project over from Neverwinter Nights into RPG in a Box and make it like a commercial project. So
hmm with RPG in a box, does it work predominantly with a first person or 3D RPG, or can be used for 2D, something like an RPG Maker?
yeah, so it's pretty flexible. There's a couple of different presets that you can kind of use. One of them, like I said, is the first person. You can do grid movement. You can do, kind of free movement, so you can make like first person shooter type things.
Mhm.
It does have 2D options, so you can make like a grid based top down 2D view type deal. So it's pretty flexible. It's a really cool engine. I think it's still growing. It's not super well known, but I like to get its name out there, and I think it's has a lot of potential, and it's really powerful when you jump into the scripting and stuff like that. It's really cool.
hmm And that's really good to hear as well. I was talking to another developer, I forget their name, a few weeks ago, and we were chatting about how a lot of these more smaller game engines, like an RPG Maker, Adventure Game Studio, that particular area of game engines has really come into its own the last 5 to 7 years. Again, if we talk specifically about RPG Maker, we were saying this 2012, 2013, people were sneering at a game made in RPG Maker. Why
Yeah.
don't you just use a Unity or an Unreal? But I think over again the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen a huge turnaround in these kinds of very smaller, very genre specific game engines
hmm
for the mainstream.
Yeah, and it's really cool because it kind of opens up the space to, when you jump into Unity, and kind of one of the reasons I went with RPG in a box is I could spend weeks and weeks and weeks in Unity
Mhm.
trying to make a grid controller,
Yep.
where an RPG in a box, I basically flip a switch, learn the scripting language, import some art assets, and you can have a prototype up and running in 30, 40 minutes. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So it really opens it up to beginner developers. You can learn, the scripting language doesn't really transfer to other engines, but the logic does, right? Learning
Hmm.
about loops and data types and things like that. So I agree with you. It's really cool that there's a lot of these kind of niche engines popping up that have specific use cases. Like, RPG Maker's been around for a long time, but it's very focused on like JRPGs,
Yep.
right? RPG in a box is pretty flexible. You can make a bunch of different stuff, but it's kind of friendly, beginner friendly in that way where you can jump in and have a cool little game going in a few minutes. So I agree. It's totally cool that stuff like that is becoming bigger, and there's lots of options out there for people.
Yeah, and what you just said about how even though like the programming and that particular thing may not transfer from engine to engine, obviously, the logic does. And that is a really great first step for a lot of developers. Like as a quick bit of or a little bit of a tangent there, that's what a lot of people were really excited about with something like Super Mario Maker when that really blew up about was like five, maybe even longer. I forget how long it's been that one out
In a
there.
while, yeah.
But just having something that is really great as a first step that you'll need to learn the programming side of things. If you just want to build the logic of the world, or in Mario Maker case, build the logic of your level design, that kind of thing, it is a really great step. And with all these kinds of like smaller game engines, we have seen some amazing stuff come out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like with like Adventure Game Studio, like how many fantastic adventure games have been released in like the last 15 years, and they really have kept like that particular style, the genre alive using AGS.
Yeah, no, it is really cool, and not just kind of like from the scripting logic, but
Hmm.
kind of level design
Yep.
or game design aspects, learning how to do that, and not just that, but for like kind of indie and solo developers, just learning how to manage your own project and manage your time
Yeah.
and manage your scope creep. All of those things are things that can kind of, a lot of games don't come out because they're like, I want to put every idea that I
Yep.
have and I want to put it in my game and release my game, and then they never release, right? They overscope it, or they burn out, or they go to the next idea. And I think some of these entry level engines kind of can introduce you to the non-programming or the non-technical aspects of managing your own project, and just learning how you deal with those kinds of things. And it can be super helpful learning how to do that and help, for
Yep.
future projects.
For sure. And it's, as you just said, it's why we see a lot of like first time entry level games tend to fail. Is that understanding the production and the game management side when it comes to game dev is not something you can really like go to school for, or even something you can like watch a tutorial for. It really comes down to you getting in the weeds and doing it yourself. And like you said, and again, like for me, like how many indie games have I covered? How many developers I've spoken to over the past 13 years that have had these ideas to work on, 5, 8, 10 year plus game developments because they want to put everything in, and
Yeah.
in a lot of those cases, those games just never come out, or they just come out and they just feel very disjointed. Like
Yeah.
it is very difficult to get your first game out there, as I'm sure you're well aware of. I'm sure everyone listening to us is very well aware of.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, I mean, every day I'm sitting here and I'm like, "Oh man, that would be so cool to put in Realms and Ruins." But I'm like, I need to pull it, I need to dial back. I
Yeah.
need to focus on, getting the things that I already have on my little Trello board, that I want to get done, and then, actually release, and then either maybe for the next project or like a DLC or a post-launch type
Hmm.
expansion type thing. That's where I can work on those extra things that may not even fit into the game right now. Like I think
Hmm.
at one point I was like, I want to have this whole sailing system and things like that. And I just sat down and thought about it, and I was like, man, that might just be too much, right? And
Hmm.
and it'll either my game is, I want to release this year, right? 2025. If I put in all the things that I thought about over the last couple of years doing this, man, I'd probably never release. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
you know.
If, definitely, and I think it's very interesting. Like by the time this cast goes up, it'll be probably a few weeks since I posted a video about sustainability and making smaller games on the YouTube channel. And one of the things I talked about in that piece was how much like kind of the mindset of indie development has changed over the past 15 years. Like I said, I've been an indie developer since 2012, and I spoke to a lot of developers around that time. There was this mentality that it's all about putting as much content into your singular game as you can. You know, create 8, 10, 15 DLCs worth of stuff and fit into your game. Put everything you want into that one project. And it led to these games having massive development cycles. But
Mhm.
there's two big problems with that. One, it balloons the amount of time and development of your game dramatically, and it makes it far less likely that that game's going to be able to either turn a profit or even just like making all that stuff fit, especially if it's your first game. Because as another point that I'm sure you're aware of, and as a lot of developers watching this are, is that it can be very alluring just to add more and more and more, and then you just end up with just this colossal mess of a game that maybe people won't even care about a lot of this stuff. They may even know that you've done all this extra work. And then that can lead to a lot of burnout for your next project.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think something like game jams can really help with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've participated the last 2 years in the Dungeon Crawler Jam, both 2024 and then just a couple weeks ago, 2025. And it gave me a nice break from my main project, some time to try some new stuff in the engine that I'm using, and just create something different, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way game jams works is you have 7 days, a couple days, whatever. I think this one was 9 days the last 2 years, and they don't announce the themes until right before it starts, so
Mm-hmm.
you can't like have anything ready to go, right? You can maybe have some art or some baseline scripting and things like that good to go, but as far as like building something out beforehand, it's not going to be feasible. And so you start working, you have that 9 days, you're super motivated to get going, and then as you get to those last couple of days, you're like, oh man, I really wanted to have this in my project, in my jam submission this year. I just don't
Mm-hmm.
have time, right? So you have to really balance, you really manage your time in these jams to reduce that scope and kind of get your critical path completed, and then you add the stuff afterwards. And I
Yep.
think those can help kind of reel you in and keep you realistic because you have to have a deadline, right? I'm an
Yep.
indie developer. I have a full-time job that, kind of funds this project, and I live off of not related to indie development. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any deadlines. I don't have a publisher breathing down my neck to get things out on time. So I can take all the time I want in the world to
Mm-hmm.
to do the things that I want to do, but at the same time I want to release one day. you know?
Yeah. And that's a really good goal to have, and it's one of the things that we talk a lot about when like getting that first game out there is one of the hardest things you can do, whether it sells or not. Just being able to put that game on a store page can be tremendously challenging, but once it's out there, then you can start building off of that, and you can start using the knowledge that you learned from game one to improve on game two and game three and so on. And it's like, as we've said a lot of times, that a lot of people, when they look at successes in the indie space, they just see the one game. They see the Darkest Dungeon, the Slay the Spire, the Angry Birds, whatever you want to say. They don't see all the failed prototypes, all the kind of false starts, and even just like all the games like these developers have worked on, who maybe it got two sales, maybe even got just one single review, and that was it. But it's all about that consistent growth, especially again if you want to be sustainable in the space.
Definitely. Yeah. And a lot of stuff that I see, you go into the developer subreddits and on some discords and stuff, and people are like, I just released my game and it failed or whatever, and they're not doing, proper marketing, or they don't have like
Yep.
a good art or whatever. It's just their first project. They just threw something out on Steam that they worked on, and it wasn't super successful. And a lot of those kind of people who have more experience come in and they're like, hey, most of these big studios, or not big studios, but like big indie games that go popular, that's like their third or fourth or maybe even fifth game that they threw
Mhm.
out there. and nobody even knew who they were. Like I think of Larian Studios, right?
Yeah.
The Divinity Original Sin guys. They kind of had a bunch of games that came out before Divinity Original Sin. None of my like gaming group even knew who they were, right? They had kind of these
Mhm.
lower budget, like action RPG type things, and once Original Sin came out, that was it. Their household name,
Yeah.
Everybody knows who they are. Now they did Baldur's Gate 3. Like there's nowhere you can go now in the gaming space and somebody doesn't know who Larian is. And what game was that? Like their fifth or sixth game that they released
Yeah.
before they really blew up. And I think that kind of translates into indie development and releasing your first game, and like you said, learning from your first game. Maybe you
Hmm.
need to market better. Maybe you need to hire an artist to do your capsule art on Steam, or maybe there's just getting more involved in your market space where I'm
Hmm.
making a dungeon crawler RPG. Well, I'm in all the dungeon crawler Reddits. I'm on the dungeon crawler
Yep.
Discord. I'm talking to all those people because that's your target audience, right? I'm not going to go into the boomer shooter Discord and and start throwing my game around because they're not, that's not the target audience, right? And you can learn from that on your next releases.
Yeah. And you mentioned game jams a few minutes ago. A game that just came out this year that's been doing some really great numbers was Look Outside, which is kind of like a horror RPG. I think it was an RPG Maker as well. And that game started out as a game jam, I remember, I think the developer was saying. And all they kind of did was, besides the game jam, was start like posting like little pictures of the game, little snippets. They had the itch demo, and the ball kind of started rolling from there. And what was the other one? Mouthwashing from last year. Like, I know the developer worked on games previously that I'm sure a lot of people have never even heard of. But
Sure.
mouthwashing being like the first big hit, it again, like, this is something I've said a lot about when it comes to like the indie dev marketing side, that your games become your marketing. That if you put out a very unique and original game and people hear about it, that sets you up for your next game and the game after that. But again, as we've been saying over like the last 5-10 minutes, it's all predicated on getting this game out there. Because I've seen developers have that struggle of, I don't, I want my first game to be perfect. It has to be, everything that I want. But what if this one little thing I don't like? Well, let me just change the whole thing. But now I'm not so sure about that, so let me change that. And then suddenly again, this 6 to 8 month, basic prototype turns into a year, and then 3 years, and it just keeps going and going. And while you're picking up some of the basic skills, as you said a few minutes ago, like especially like the management side, being able to manage yourself, that is incredibly difficult. No matter if you're a sole developer or you're working on a team, because I've seen both sides struggle tremendously on that front.
Yeah, and what's that famous quote? Perfection is the enemy of progress. I think it was like Winston Churchill or something, right? Like you said, getting something and making every little piece perfect, or changing it where you didn't like it to make it perfect. And I was actually in an Neverwinter Nights project. It was a community project, and the person kind of running it, and I'm not going to say any names, but they were kind of like that, right? The
Mm-hmm.
project went on for years and years because they wanted every little thing to be perfect. And sometimes you just got to be like, it's good enough,
Yeah.
and then move on to the next thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've done a consulting with some developers as well, and I've seen that kind of struggle of, the first idea is like, we want every single thing in this game, and then it's like, okay, how are you going to do it? And there's no answer for that. So we have to scale it down and scale it down.
Yep.
And there are people who hate that for, again, for a very obvious reason. You're, as we've used that expression, you're what was it? You're throwing the baby out with with the water. You're killing your darlings,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it is very tough for people to kind of get their head around, because, as we said, at the end of the day, if the game doesn't come out, where's your kind of progress as a developer? Because you can keep making prototypes, you can keep coming up with crazy ideas, day in and day out, but until you can actually put a game out onto a store page, no one's going to know who you are. And if they don't know who you are, they're not going to be, checking you out. They're not going to be following you on any kind of social media, or even just following what your studio's doing.
Yeah, I agree, and I even encounter that too. I mean, you find a game, you just come across something that looks cool, maybe it was an early access or had some demo or something,
Mm-hmm.
and then you look in the Steam discussions or the subreddit, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, the game's dead. We haven't heard from the developer for
Yep.
years." Maybe they're still working on it, but at that point, I'm gone, right? I'm already moving on to the next one that the developer is active and doing stuff. Not gonna waste my time, right?
Yeah. And again, like, what's the other expression? Like, ideas are, cheap. It's very hard to actually put them into practice. And when, like, as you've been saying, like, like, I guess as a quick, to clarify, with Realms, is this a solo project or you work with, like, a small team for it?
No, I'm completely solo. Yep.
All right. As a sole developer, then, and again, like, this is something I'm sure a lot of students and even like for summers are always like struggling with. Like, how do you start? I guess like compartmentalizing like the progress or the work you need to do for a game like this. Because as we've said, and again, like I've interviewed so many developers who've had the struggle of I can do anything I want. So what do I do?
Yeah, so for me, so like I mentioned, it was kind of a lift and shift from my Neverwinter Nights project to RPG in a box. And there isn't a ton of translation there in terms of like I can take, the scripting from Neverwinter Nights and put it in an RPG in a box. But as far as like the world lore, and I had like one of those grid maps that kind of outlined like the different maps that you could travel into or the zones. So I kind of had some foundational stuff for like the story and the quest that I wanted to include. And then after like took that documentation and translated it in a way that I can put it into RPG in a box. Really the way I started working on it was I know I want like this arc of the story to happen, so I'm going to work on that arc of the story. So I make the maps, the scripts, the quests, the dialogue, all of that good stuff related to that arc of the story. And then kind of had the midpoint of the game and I worked on like those things and then at the end. But what started happening kind of going back onto the scope creep thing is I kept working on things outside of like the critical path. So I
Mm-hmm.
was like, this part of the story or this part of the world doesn't feel fleshed out enough. Let me do some side quests or let me
Mm-hmm.
build a just some more side content that makes it feel more fleshed out. And I was like, I really need to get to the point where my storyline is done. So like 6 months ago, I had my Trello board and I was like, this is the critical path. These are the things that I need to do. I need to have this storyline, these maps, this stuff in. And I just want to do straight critical path and be done with it. So I think maybe around December, so earlier this year, basically, or near the end of last year, I actually finished the critical pass. So Realms and Ruins is you can fire it up, you can play it from start to finish,
Mm-hmm.
and the game's complete in that way, right? So now after that, I've said my game storyline is complete. Now I'm going back in and filling out the world and not feeling that pressure that I'm not making progress on the final product in a way that I can't complete the main quest, right? You can complete the main quest, and right now I'm going back and filling in that side content where the world feels a little more, less barren, less bare bones, and then I'll be done and I'll release.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I broke down my progress on the game.
Yeah. And I think that was very smart to do. Get again like what the main chunk of your game is about done before fleshing out all that style stuff. Because again, there's that temptation to just keep adding more and more side content, more and more stuff off that path. And
Yep,
there are people who they will never see that stuff, no matter how much work you put into it. And
exactly. Yep,
if your main game isn't good, no one's gonna care about 50 hours of bonus stuff on top of a bad game. And
exactly.
again, like this is the kind of stuff that when we talk about like in like this kind of like one-on-one conversation, it sounds very much like a no-brainer thing to do. But again, I don't think I can count how high or how many developers have struggled with just getting your main core gameplay done.
Yep. Yeah, and even well, and for me personally, and I'm sure there's people out there who felt similar, but while I was making that side content, before I finished the critical path of the game, I just felt like I wasn't making progress, right? Like
Hmm.
I would make a little side map here, do a little side quest, and then I'd be like, well, my friends would be like, "Hey, how's the game going?" I'm like, I guess it's okay. I'm getting some side stuff done." But then once I actually like sat down and just did Critical Path main quest and finally finished it, it was like a tremendous like lift off of my shoulders because I'm like, my game's done. I can say it's done.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And then now I can take my time and not feel like I'm just like not progressing any, but I'm just filling out the world where, the rest of the game just has more content to it. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? I could release it today. My
Yeah.
game would be releasable today and I could keep working on it, but I don't want to do that, right? I'm not big
Hmm.
on the early access thing, you know what I mean? But yeah, I could release the game today and people could play it from start to finish and it would be good. But there's, some stuff I want to put in that I held off on and I think probably the best choice in the end to do it that way.
Hmm. And to clarify for people listening to us, how long have you been working on Realms 4?
So it was officially released 2 years ago in June. So June 2023 is when I announced it and had my Steam page put up. And I was probably working on it for maybe 4 or 5 months before that. I really wanted to have like the core concept down and some good screenshots and video for, a trailer for my Steam page and all that. So officially announced 2 years ago, roughly.
And again, like usually, like 12 to 18 months is like what we usually say is like a solid kind of like first timer project for a lot of smaller games. So, and you are, as you said earlier, planning on releasing Realms and Ruins for 2025, like formally.
Yeah, and I don't have an official like month, but I'm closing in on the finish line, right? The lights at the end of the tunnel. I've got to finish a little bit of that side content, and then I really need to do a lot of play testing, and I have some kind of a closed circle of friends that'll help me out with that, and then I'll be ready for official release. So, um, assuming nothing goes wrong, I think I can definitely get it out this year for sure.
Nice. And we haven't touched too much on the gameplay yet. So I guess for you, like, what was it like coming up with the actual gameplay you wanted? Because again, when we talk about like dungeon crawlers, first-person RPGs, there is a massive spectrum of the genre out there to look at and analyze.
Sure. Yeah. So the RPG in a box that I'm using, there are some limitations on that front, but you can kind of change some things up and add some, with some creative scripting, you can make things different from the default, right? So if you just kind of turn on the grid movement and throw up some art and get a prototype going, it's basically just you can either do kind of the roguelike like bump fighting where you take
Hmm.
turns, so turn based, or you can have, where you can equip weapons and then kind of real time, and you can set the delay on the weapon so you can attack, once a second or once every half second or whatever. So my game is officially real time. So, but a lot of the things that I have is uh, the different weapons do different things. So while on the surface, you kind of start the game and it's just kind of you're hitting the enemies and that's it, right? Later weapons and you can get skills and spells and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff has like on hit scripting done. So when you hit the enemy, something happens. So either it gives it some sort of status effect or it hits, like AoE, like the enemies around, like surrounding it, and things like that. So kind of a lot of those old dungeon crawlers are fairly basic, right? They're probably more a product of their time than anything, due to the constraints of hardware and just general game design philosophy in general. And there a lot of them are based on like D&D, right? A lot of
Hmm.
D&D type rules, and so mine is fairly similar in a way, except there's a lot more going on with like the on hit stuff, right? So spell effects, debuffs, resistances, things like that. There's a lot of that incorporated into it.
And with kind of creating things real time, how has that been in terms of creating the combat system?
So, being my first project and learning more about the dungeon crawler community, I've learned that not everyone likes the real time stuff. Um, there's the old like, and part of the reason I wanted to make it real time is This is another thing that I think is a little bit different from a lot of the dungeon crawlers I've played, is a lot of the bosses have unique mechanics. So I didn't want it to just be like the boss is just a harder version of every other enemy you've fought before, right? Just more HP and does more damage. There's actually mechanics in some of the boss fights. So, and I think the real time I've kind of designed around that in a way where, you know, for example, one of the bosses has different phases. So where you kind of like defeat the first phase, he
Mhm.
flies up in the air and starts shooting fireballs down at you. So part of that is you have to dodge the fireballs, and it's you could do that in kind of the turn base, but
Mhm.
I think it works easier real time where you can actually like step out of the way of a fireball coming at you type of thing, right? So that's part of my decision to make it real time was stuff like that. I think the mechanics that I put into many of the boss fights work a little bit better in real time than they would turn based.
And I have to ask, did you play like a Legend of Grimrock? That really did
Oh
kind
yeah,
of yeah, bring
of
that
course, yeah.
style back. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of revived the genre, right? It was a big deal, and then shortly after that, I think Ubisoft was like, "Hey, we want to jump back into this," and they made Might and Magic 10
Mhm.
Legacy, which came out not too long after that. But yeah, definitely Grimrock. I loved it. I'm actually playing through Might and Magic 10 right now, so not taking too many influences from it, but just playing it for fun because I didn't really get through it back in the day when it came out. So.
Mhm. I think like the first one that really like got me into dungeon crawling way back, or at least way back for the youngins watching, was the Adrian Ozzy series on the Nintendo DS, and that was more like turn based. It was kind of more like a JRPG meets dungeon crawler.
Yeah, I am familiar with the series. I have not played them. I think I played them briefly. I didn't have that system growing up, so
Hmm.
I think I played later on. I know they just re-released too, like
Hmm.
the enhanced editions on Steam.
Yeah.
I just haven't gotten them back around to
Hmm.
buying it and playing them yet, but they're on my radar, so it's definitely something I want to try out.
Yeah. I picked them when they were on sale like a year or so ago. I haven't touched them since. I There's just so many things to get through. And with the realms and runes, in terms of, I guess, like enemy design or enemy behavior, this is another thing that's always very interesting when we talk about like the kind of first person dungeon crawler. Like there are some games where the enemies have just like very basic ideas. They'll just follow you like one step at a time. I played one I think in 2024 that was like the enemies were a little bit more like engaged in terms of like following you around, using attacks at long range, that kind of thing. So with your game, what's kind of like the enemy design like?
Sure, yeah. So I kind of have it's kind of similar across all of the areas of my game. You know, you go to one area and you're fighting orcs, you go to another area, you're fighting, whatever like for that area there's like an underwater zone, so you're fighting fish and stuff like that. But kind of back on my like combat philosophy is there's your basic like melee enemies, there's enemies that are ranged attacks, and then I kind of have like magic enemies. And so it kind of goes back to the um my comment about how I'm designing the combat with like on hit scripting, right? And that's
Hmm.
just like kind of the term that is used in RPG in a box is when something hits, you can make it do something else outside of the basic combat system. So, like I said, a lot of like effects. So, like, there's some fish in the underwater areas that can like stun you, and you have ways to prevent that. There's some other things where, poison and bleed and things like that. So, damage over time type effects. Um, but yeah, mostly, pretty straightforward melee range and magic stuff, and then whatever effects come from those based on the type of enemy.
Hmm. And you said a few minutes ago about the boss designs, like trying to do like a little bit more like engagement there.
hmm
What was that kind of like fitting something like that into a again like when we talk about most dungeon crawlers, it is kept very like enemy walks, you walk in them, and we just do this for like five
Exactly.
minutes.
Yeah, so that was just me wanting to get away from that, what you just described, right? You move up, they move up, and then you just bump until something dies or whatever, right? So, I really wanted to have the boss rooms be a little more interesting than just with that. And I say boss rooms like they're not just rooms where a boss is, but there's things that are a little more organic than that. But besides the point. Yeah, but as far as like the design of the bosses, I wanted them to each have something unique and something a little bit different than just fighting them. For example, like I said, there's the fireball one where you have to actually actively dodge the fireballs and do something else to get him to go to the next phase. There's like a desert dungeon where the boss has like creates clones of himself. So you have to find out which one is not the clone and then continue attacking or kill all the clones and then you'll know which one's the real one. So just little stuff like that to kind of change it up a little bit beyond the, you know, stepping up to each other and then just trading attacks back and forth type of thing.
With like character design, so you haven't touched on that one yet. Is this a game where you have like different classes, warrior, mage, thief, whatever, or is it just more like equipment based? Like if you use a sword, you're a warrior. If you use a staff, you're a mage. That kind of thing.
Sure, yeah, so it's not party based. So you play a single character, so it's not a blobber in the sense of the term if you're familiar with that. So you're a single character. When you level up, you have different stats that you get points for, and then so you can kind of focus into something and then there's, spells, magic type weapons and things like that. So there's like three primary stats. There's strength, intelligence, and dexterity, and then a couple of other things that kind of are behind the scenes based off of those. But yeah, so strength is kind of like your normal like melee type weapons. The dexterity improves like your critical chance, but then there's going to be there's some weapons that are based off of dex, so they get bonuses based off of using the or has a requirement of like a minimum dexterity type number to be able to equip those weapons, and then your intelligence is kind of like your magic stuff. So there's both magic like skills you can get, and then like magic items that scale based off of your intelligence. So you can kind of build your character how you want in a way, but there's not like designated classes. Like when you go to start the game, you're not picking wizard or something like that.
Okay. With like the spell system, is it going to be a case where you have like spells that can be like long range projectiles, buffs, debuffs, that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of your standard like damage type spells, but there's also going to be like buffs for yourself. And I even want to do like, and this is probably one of those scope creep things, and I haven't fully fleshed it out yet. But back in some of those older games like the Might and Magics and stuff, you would have like non-combat spells, but they let you do things that are kind of like different than I feel like a lot of RPGs do nowadays. Just something simple like levitate, right? Levitate or some sort of fly spell that lets you fly around and get to areas that you couldn't before. So I want to do something like that with maybe not fly, but something along those lines where everything's not just combat focused, right? You get some new spell, it gives you some way to traverse the land that you couldn't before, and you can go into new areas or something like that. So yeah, like you said, the kind of standard damage type spells, some buffs and debuffs, and then also something to like open up new areas of the game for you.
Mm-hmm. And like to go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about scope creep and just kind of adding more and more in, like this is again like another area where there's potentially a lot of things you can do, and kind of
Hmm.
almost becomes like a quasi like Metroidvania in that respect.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, add a new area. How we get there, we add a new spell, and then we have to make sure that spell is balanced, and then we add something else on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I already have so one of them is like you get the ability to like breathe underwater, and so I have different areas that you can kind of like not backtrack, but they're kind of areas that you'll pass through again anyway in a way, and like they're just on the way, right? I'm sort of a fan of backtracking as long as it's meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going through a dungeon and then just running back out for no reason doesn't feel great. But if you go into a dungeon and learn a new skill and then you come back through and you're hitting those things that require that skill and it opens up the dungeon a little bit on the way back through, that I'm a fan of.
Mm-hmm.
So just back to your point, like you said, if I put this fly system in, and that's just something I've kind of been rumbling around in my head over the last couple of years, um, that, like you said, could be a massive scope creep thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I put in teasers at the beginning of the game where there's like a gap or a cliff between you and some treasure chest on the other side, I have to figure out a way to make it meaningful and then also manage the scope creep that could come along with that kind of ability, right? Because if I
Hmm.
do something simple where it's just a chest and you get an item, mm, does that make having that spell worth it? Or if I make it where there's like a whole section of a whole new dungeon that you can go into with it, maybe that's a little bit more meaningful, but you kind of have to balance that and not go crazy with it, but also keep it so it's worth the player going back and using the spell or whatever, right?
Hmm. And with the like gear progression in Realms, this is another interesting point. We've seen some games go for, either randomly generated gear, or there's like this huge list of every different sword, spear, mace, and whatnot. In terms of like, I guess like the set ways you can equip stuff in Realms, what's kind of been like the approach you went with?
So everything's going to be handcrafted. So the world's handcrafted, the items are handcrafted, the spells are handcrafted. Not that I'm not a fan of like Diablo type randomized loot systems. It just wasn't the way I wanted to do things in this game. I'm a big fan, back in the day, and I still play it a little bit now, was EverQuest. So it's a fantasy MMO. And the thing that felt meaningful to me in that game is you go on a raid and you get some really cool item, and it like really changes the power level of your character. And it felt like you earned something, right? Some of these randomly generated games, to me, you get an item and you're like, oh, it's plus one more of the stat that I already have a ton of, or
Hmm.
it just gives you some marginal benefit. Um, I wanted to do specifically handcrafting everything because I want to make exploration feel meaningful, and I wanted to make killing bosses feel meaningful, where you get some cool item out of killing some, like kind of going on the side content, going on that side boss and killing it and getting some cool item that you never would see elsewhere in the game. I kind of think back to like Skyrim or like Oblivion or something. You go through the bandit tower and then you get a potato and a carrot and some gold at the end, and it's just like, it doesn't feel very meaningful. And that's why I think the handcrafting, kind of hand making, and deliberately placing things throughout the world that make exploration worth it, I think for me is the way I like some of my RPGs to be, and that's how I wanted this to be.
Hmm. And it also allows you to be a little bit more creative with the different weapon designs themselves. That you, if you're making anything handmade, you can say this sword, spits triple fireballs out, or this
Exactly.
spear is a lightning blast. And to your point about kind of procedural generation in that respect, yeah, it's something that I've seen in a lot of like lesser ARPGs as well, where the marketing plug is, everything is procedurally generated, and that's great, but if there's no, I guess, like control over that, you can have that case where you spend the last 20 minutes fighting this epic boss, and your role is, a sword that does maybe 2% more damage than what you just spent the last 30 minutes fighting with.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's a place for that and a market for
Mm-hmm.
that. It's just not the design philosophy I wanted to take with this game, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
totally nothing wrong with it. I played Diablos and ARPGs and all that. I'm totally fine with that when that's what I'm looking for. This game specifically, I didn't want it to kind of be roguelike, all the world's handcrafted, all the maps I'm making myself and designing things in a very deliberate way. And like you said, I can make things feel unique. You're not just going and replacing your +2 sword with a +3 sword type of thing, and that way it just feels more meaningful to me to have things designed in that way.
And again, it's that kind of struggle of how much involvement you want with these elements, because like we've seen like on like the higher end of the scale in terms of ARPG or procedural design, like you can create gear that just goes like really like off the wall. Now the sword is a triple fireball heat seeking death beam zombie summoner, and then it sounds great and all, but how do you build something that capitalizes on all that great stuff? Because if you don't, then it just, again, as we've been saying, it just becomes like filler for your game.
hmm And I think part of what I'm doing too is I want the treasure to be like kind of thematic to the
Hmm.
things that you're doing. So, in one of the underwater dungeons, you find a cool magic like trident, right? Like I wouldn't want that randomly generated like a water themed weapon to randomly generate in my volcano dungeon. That would be it kind of takes you out of the experience. You go into these specific dungeons that I guess you can call them biomes, and you find cool thematic things. And one of the things that I think about is like the old, like literally Final Fantasy 1, right? The old
Hmm.
JRPG, you go in the volcano dungeon, you're finding your flame swords, you're finding your fire armor, you're finding your cool stuff like that. And that's kind of what to me feels neat, right? Like you sort of know what to expect, but you're getting different things by going to different places instead of, like you said, just the random triple fireball sword showing up anywhere in the game, no matter where you go,
Hmm.
and it just kind of makes it dilutes some of the exploration for me.
Hmm. And with exploration in that respect for realms, as you said, like with the idea of having different spells or having that be a way of exploring more of the world, how involved are you planning like world exploration to be? And what I mean by that is like will there be elements that require like some sense of platforming? Or is this all kind of kept within like I guess like the constraints or the rules of a grid-based RPG?
Yeah, sure. So there's not really any platforming or anything like that. However, it is quote unquote open world.
Mm-hmm.
When you start the game, you can pretty much go anywhere with the exception of things where like you have to get and I know I mentioned this earlier with like a sailing system. You do get an ability to like buy a boat, but it's not super fleshed out. It just lets you traverse across the water
Mm-hmm.
instead of being some full scale sailing system. But there's kind of like some blockers like that. But for the most part, once you kind of unlock those things that give you access to the rest of the world, you can go anywhere. So there's no constraints like that. In terms of like platforming, not really. There's no platforming, but I do have like puzzles. I always like kind of the old dungeon crawlers where you
Mm-hmm.
go in and you have some puzzle to solve, that sort of thing. But no real platforming or anything like that. No.
All right. And with kind of I guess building the progression, the world, and as another question for you, what's been like kind of like the approach to I guess like quote unquote progression in a game like this? Because as you said, it is open world, which means that outside like the super dangerous or very specific areas, the player can go anywhere they want. And of course, the challenge then becomes how does the player understand that they can go anywhere they want within your space?
That's a good question. It's not explicit that you can go anywhere. But the main quest, so there's the main quest, right? That's kind of like what's pushing the player forward for the most part, unless you just pull a Skyrim and you go off and do whatever you want, right? But yeah, the main quest does become the primary focus when you start the game, and you kind of go through, the first initial dungeons, and then a thing happens, and that leads to you to, and there's also choices, right? You don't have to go to from A to B. You can kind of go from A to C. There's kind of like multiple things you could be doing at once, or you can choose one or the other. But the main quest definitely is like, hey, this is what you should be doing, and then it progresses from there when you like, get to different parts of the adventure. So the primary focus is the main quest, and that kind of pushes you to those areas where you should be and you would technically be level appropriate for.
Mm-hmm. And with like leveling and I guess like stat progression along those lines, with realms, it's going to be a case where I guess like gear is your like primary progression. That if you're not wearing the higher up enough armor or using a strong enough sword or spear, you can't fight the enemy. Or like the stats, I guess they're trying to think how I want to phrase this. Like the stats make you better, but the game is not like going to hard punish you for not hitting like a high enough level or something like that.
So that is something that I'm still working through. I think the first like I call it the first half of my game that I've had several people play test, and I've played test, but it's different when I'm doing it, right? Because I know everything and all the best things to do. But the first half of my game is pretty well balanced, where you get to a point where the stats don't really determine, or rather, sorry, the equipment that you have doesn't determine your power level. It's more that the stats that you choose when you level up influences the type of equipment that you want to be using. So if you're pumping your intelligence and you have a couple of wands or whatever, switching to a sword probably isn't in your best interest, right? You're going to be more powerful using a magic based item where the damage scaling is off of your intelligence rather than off of your strength. A lot of that is really just a ton of play testing, though, and that's going to be one of the biggest challenges up
Mm-hmm.
to release is play testing all of the things where it just feels right. But there's also at the same time nothing stopping players from grinding. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to grind, at least in the parts that I'm confident have been balanced pretty well. But people, that's just some people just like the grind, right? And they can get super overpowered and just burn through the game without really, if they spend the time doing that. And at the same time, yeah, just a lot of play testing. That's really going to be the biggest challenge leading up to release is trying to make it feel right. Or back to the grinding thing is if you just blow all your money on potions, you could probably just kind of potion your way through some of the more difficult content if you're not the right level. Is that the way I like to play games? No, but you could probably pull that off. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and with the world design itself, do enemies respawn, or is there a fixed number of enemies in the world?
Yeah, so it's respawned, and I did that deliberately because I wanted to. Some people just like to grind, and then in some games. So this is a good example. So I'm playing through Might and Magic 10 right now. The enemies do not respawn in that game, but when you die, one of your party members die, they don't get experience from that combat.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes combat frustrating in a way where if you're like, oh crap, somebody died, they're now not getting experience. You can't just go back and grind some repopping enemies to make up for that experience loss. Um, and and it makes it difficult, right? Because I think in that game you can pretty much get to the point where if you had enough characters die and lose experience, like you just can't be strong enough to continue forward. And I don't want to have the player be stuck in a way where they like soft locked themselves, where they have nowhere else to go and no enemies to grind to get more powerful. And I hate using the word grind, but yeah, that's kind of my thought process there is I want players to be able to grind if they want to, but not also get stuck if they just can't get to another area where they can get some level ups or power up in some other way.
And the fear of soft locking can be very big in games like this. You get into the wrong area, you have enough potions to get back out, and then your
Hmm.
character's kind of done.
Yep.
Trying to think if there's anything else in terms of design. I guess with realms and kind of like working through like the main path, and I guess as you said, working now on like fleshing out more side content. What does like side content in a game like this look like? Because again, like as we said, like with many of the larger examples, you can have like very multifaceted quests, like the whole Elder Scrolls side of things.
Yeah, so I'll just give an example of just one of the towns that you get to on the main quest. So one of the towns you get to, it's like a castle town. There's a bunch of humans everywhere, and that part of the quest has you going and fighting some orcs that are like, giving the town some issues, right? So that's the main quest part of it. One of the side quests is going to like the captain of the guard, and he says, "Hey, we're having some, we have all my guards. They're working on keeping the orcs at bay, but there's also this other threat in the region that I'm having issues with." So you can kind of go off, to the side. You can find some side areas and go fight this thing, and then go back to the captain of the guard, and then he teaches you a skill. So that's an example of some of the side content. So just a basic like, kind of go kill quest. Um, and then in other parts, I have like whole dungeons that are side quests, completely
Mhm.
optional. And you can go into them. You get, of course, you get treasures and rewards, and you have some decisions based on how the quest plays out. So yeah, anything from just like your kind of basic like go kill quest to like full-fledged dungeons that are off to the side that you never even have to encounter if you don't want to.
And I think this has been a great conversation so far. Again, when it comes to dungeon crawling or RPG design, we can easily go for hours and hours on end.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Trying to think if there's any like final like last minute design questions I have for you. While I'm thinking about that, anything else about Realms and Runes that we didn't touch on that you would like to bring up?
No, I think we touched on a good bit of stuff. Yeah, just yeah, nothing in particular.
All right. So I guess like as I kind of like to start to wrap things up as a good I guess like final question design wise for you. As we've said, like RPG design is very multifaceted. It's also very large, as I'm sure you're well aware of, in terms of how much you can build into a game. And one question that I like to ask a lot of developers is ending a game like this. So how did you like when coming up with the main content figure out or come to like terms of how long do I really want the main game to be in this respect?
Interesting. I don't know if I ever thought I want this game to be X amount of time long.
Mhm.
I think I kind of had the over like kind of meta plot in my head. Like I wanted, this is the hook. This is how the player starts out, and you get wrapped into this, whatever global calamity that's threatening the land, and then the midpoint of the game where something happens that kind of keeps you on that path, and then dealing with it at the end of the game. I have a buddy who's been play testing for me and helping me out a lot with kind of from a player perspective. And he gets through like the first area of the game in like 10 hours. We'll say like the first quarter of the game. And I'm not saying this is representative by any means, but he's one of those people that he will look at every square on the map to try and find every nook and cranny and secret thing. So for a player like him, he could probably easily get like 30, 40 hours out of the game. Uh, to me, I think obviously I know the game. I could probably get it through. I did like a full play test the first half of the game, and it took maybe a couple hours. So I think for the average player, this is just a total guess, like maybe 10 to 15 hours, maybe 20 hours, depending on what kind of player you are. But I never set out to be like, I want my game to be a 40-hour epic adventure. I kind of had the idea of how I wanted it to be, and then I just built things around that. And I never went into making something saying, I want this to take an hour, just to take an hour of the
Mhm.
player's time. I'm not really designing it in a way where I want to. I'm trying to word it. I don't want to waste the player's time. I feel like everything is made with intention where you feel like you're making progress in some way. But, you can choose to do the side content, you choose not to. But I never set out to make a game where I said I want it to be 40 hours. It just might end up being that way, you know?
And regarding playtesting, I think that's another interesting point we can touch on for a few minutes. Was this is another area where I see sometimes first time and smaller developers struggle with. What's been like your approach to like reaching out to playtesters, setting up playtesting, things like that?
Sure. Yeah. So right now, a lot of my playtesting has been done by just kind of close friends, personal friends that I know, like in real life. I also did attend a indie developer convention. So I had a demo out that people could play, probably like a 10 or 15-minute demo, and I got a lot of feedback there. Not That's not really play testing, but you can still get feedback to improve other parts of the game in that way. And then also, I'm part of that Dungeon Crawler Discord, so the dungeoncrawler.org Discord that's all about these kind of grid-based
Mm-hmm.
RPGs. They live and breathe all of that stuff. And being a part of those game jams too, um, getting people's feedback, and it's not feedback on Realms and Ruins necessarily, but it's feedback that I can incorporate into Realms and Ruins that can make the game better. So because like you said with QA or whatever quality, play testing and things like that. The way I play the game is going to be totally different than other people, and I know everything about the game. So in game jams, getting that perspective from a bunch of other people playing the game and being able to see them play it and get that like kind of real time feedback is super valuable. But to your point, to your question, really is getting involved in the communities. So dungeoncrawlers.org, I've already had people say, "Hey, you have a demo or something?" And I was like, I can make something available, and you guys can help, kind of play and give me feedback and that sort of thing. So, yeah, mostly getting involved in the community, and then just reaching out to friends and family to help you play test.
Yeah. And being able to like reach out to like different websites, different jams, that kind of thing is a good first step. And I guess I'm not sure if there's a like, really good answer for this, but in terms of like finding like jams and stuff like this, is there like a central source, or is it just like searching on Google, game jam for genre X?
So I've kind of come to so I joined dungeoncrawlers.org, their Discord, just kind of like searching for dungeon crawlers and stuff like that to play. And then I learned that they did their jam every year and they host that on itch. And then at the same time, you can go to itch.io and I think there's just a jams link. And they literally have like a list and a calendar of all kinds of different jams that are going on at this current time, or you can see in the future with jams that are. Yeah, it's sorry, I just went into itch to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn here. But yeah, if you go to itch.io and you just click the jams link, like there's literally just like hundreds going on at any given time, probably in any genre you can think of. I mean, I'm just scrolling through right here. Like right now, there's the psychological horror game jam. There's the TTRPG manifesto jam. So itch is a super good resource, and I think probably in those communities that are kind of developer focused, a lot of those people like to do jams related to the genre that they're fans of at the same time. For dungeoncrawlers.org, for example, and that's kind of how I learned how where those jams come from. So itch primarily.
I guess as a final like design production question for you before we wrap things up, for any like solo developers or people listening to us who may have an idea for a game or they would like to try and do something like this as like their first step, any like tips or tricks you can give in terms of kind of I guess like beginning this first step as a solo developer?
So I was in a Discord once and I was kind of like humming and hawing about developing a game. And I made a comment one day, and I had been in that Discord for like a couple of years, right? Kind of lurking, participating in some conversations, asking about like development stuff. And one of the mods just said to me, "Hey, you've been here a long time. Why don't you just hurry up and make the game already?" You know what I mean? So it's easier said than done, but I think really just getting started is the biggest first step to making a game, right? Because you see on like the indie developer subreddits, there's a lot of people who have ideas, and they're always like, "Hey, how can I do it this way?" Or "Hey, would any developer like to help me make my idea come true?" The idea guys, right? The, everybody has, like you said, ideas are cheap. They're easy, that it doesn't take anything to have the idea, but to actually like just sit down and do it, I think is the biggest first step. In addition to kind of just doing it, right? That's a little easy to say, easier said than done. Is like really, in my opinion, make the game that you want to make. I think it's a lot of people get wrapped up in these like the big indie breakout hit of the week and they want to copy it. Vampire Survivors, I think, was a that one just kind of came out of nowhere, and then 2 weeks later, there's like 5 or 6 different kind of clones that came out in addition. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I think I'm making a game I want to make because I loved dungeon crawlers growing up, and I found an engine that works for me that I really enjoy making, and I'm making a game that I want to play. I'm not making a game to try and uh, get a quick buck off of the big hit of the week or whatever. And that's okay. People want to pursue money if that's how you want to do it. But I just want to
Hmm.
make a game that I think is fun in a genre that I've enjoyed growing up in and being a part of that community and contributing to that kind of genre there.
All right, sounds good. Yep. And again, just getting out there and making, something is an important first step for this. And I guess here's the question I always like to ask developers, probably the scariest question of all. Once Realms and Runes is finished, do you have an idea for what's next for you?
Yeah. So, my first game jam for Dungeon Crawler Jam was in 2024, and I made a pretty cool sci-fi dungeon crawler that rated pretty well in the jam, and it's something I've wanted to continue. I just haven't yet because I'm focusing on Realms right now, and definitely something in the sci-fi. There's not a ton of sci-fi dungeon crawlers, and I may not even necessarily go like full dungeon crawler, but jury's still out, right? Like I got to finish Realms and then I'll sit down and kind of look at my approach after that. But definitely something sci-fi, maybe another dungeon crawler, maybe not. But yeah, I'd like to continue some of that.
So, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We already talked about Realms going to be on both itch and on Steam.
Hmm.
I guess I'm trying to think anything. I guess like any like final points, any final thoughts before we wrap things up.
No, I think the biggest thing, like I said, is just get started. That was the biggest thing for me, and that mod of that Discord saying, "Hey, you've been here a while. Why don't you just make a game already?" Kind of hit home for me, where I'm like, you know what, I really should. I should just do it, and I am. I'm just doing it. You know.
Yep. All right. Well, I think with that, I am about out of questions. Again, we could go on and on about RPG design, and if you're free in the future, maybe either like closer to the game being out or even when it's finished, we can certainly have you back on and talk more about wrapping things up.
Great. Yeah, that would be awesome. Appreciate you having me. It was a pleasure, and I had a lot of fun.
Hmm. Oh, I guess as a quick final, I guess like fun question, any dungeon crawlers you would recommend to people listening to check out?
Ooh, so there's a ton of really good ones. I don't want to recommend a specific commercial release. I would actually like to point people to dungeoncrawlers.org, the most recent game jam, or even just the most recent couple of years worth of game jams. Like the top 25 games are all dungeon crawlers, and they're just amazing. There's some really awesome entries in there. They're, kind of bite sized because they're jam games. You can usually finish most of them in, 30 minutes to an hour or whatever. And there's a ton of variety. So I don't want to point to a commercial release. I would say check out some of those jam entries because they're just a ton of fun, and there's a wide variety. You'll definitely find something you like.
All right. And for you, any social media you like to mention, websites, Twitter, X, Blue Sky, whatever?
Yeah, I am on Blue Sky. Let me see how I have it. So it's at Bonedude Game Studios.itch.io. So that's also my itch page, but that's at the same time it's hooked to my Blue Sky. So
Right.
that's the two places that I post some updates, and I do my devlogs and things like that. And you can find my Steam page on those too.
All right, sounds good. I'll include links to that down below for people listening to us. So, with that, I think we'll say goodnight for this conversation. As I said at the start, for people listening, if you are a developer working on an upcoming game, want to talk game design, anything with game dev or game design related, please reach out. For those of you who watch us on YouTube, do the YouTubing stuff, do the liking, commenting, buy all the copies of the books and stuff along those lines. And be sure to check out Realms and Ruins as well. So, Bonebrah, once again, thank you so much for coming on. Best of luck with finishing the game, and hopefully we'll have you back on in the future to talk more about RPGs.
Sounds great. I had fun. Thanks again.
All right. So, for those of you watching, be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you examine the art and science of games. Until our next chat, have a great night.